Episode 4. A mill turns into a tannery. By 1840, Rose had become its own township. The people of Rose had elected their first government, and for the most part, those government officials were living on farms scattered along the few roads that existed in Rose Township by that time. David Gage Tavern had become a post office and a stagecoach stop. It appeared that a little community was beginning to grow in Section 22 of Rose Township. But what was happening nearby? What was happening in Springfield Township, for example? Well, Springfield was getting its own little settlement here in Section 17. In 1836, Cornelius Davis had come to Springfield Township with several of his sons. He had purchased the entire 640 acres of Section 17. The Shiawassee River flowed right through that land. In 1836, he built a dam on the Shiawassee and a sawmill. In 1854, his son John C. Davis built a big grist mill right in the same area. Around those two mills, the community of Davisburg began to grow. And here in Holly Township, very close to the Rose border, another little community was starting to grow. In 1836, Ira C. Alger purchased land in Section 34 of Holly Township. The Shiawassee River flowed right through his land. In 1843, he built a dam on the river and a sawmill. Just 1 year later, in 1844, he built a grist mill at the same site. Around those mills, the community of Holly began to grow. It was a pattern that was repeated all over Oakland County. A sawmill, a grist mill, and then a community begins to grow. But what about Rose Township? Did it get a mill? Well, first of all, what do you need for a mill? What kind of location? Well, you need proximity to raw materials needed for the mill. So for a sawmill, you needed to be close to trees. And for a grist mill, close to grains. You needed a stream or a river with a dependable flow of water and sufficient fall to turn a water wheel, enough of a drop in elevation. You also needed an upstream landscape to support the building of a dam to create a mill pond, and a downstream landscape to support a canal leading to the mill to allow for water to drain away. And finally, you needed the ability to easily transport materials to and from the mill, and also to markets where the lumber or the flour could be sold. In 1835, Jacob Voorhees and David Hammond thought they'd found that kind of a location in Section 11 of Rose Township. The Shiawassee River flowed through their land. There was plenty of timber in the area. A perfect location, they thought, for a sawmill. But tragedy in the Voorhees family, culminating in his own death in 1836, resulted in the fact the mill was never built. But just to the south, in 1843, Ephraim McWithy had purchased land in Section 23 of Rose. Now, Ephraim McWithy wasn't living in Rose at the time. He was living in White Lake Township. He'd had an original land patent for land there. But it appears that the McWithy family was interested in building a mill, and the land in White Lake wasn't a good location. So it's likely that's why they purchased the land in Rose. The Buckhorn Creek ran right through it. The McWithy family did build their mill but it wasn't until the 1880s. Why did it take so long? Well, mills were expensive to build, especially the machinery that went with a mill. So it's possible they hadn't had enough money to complete the mill until the 1880s. But between the failed attempt of the mill in 1835 and the building of the mill in 1880, there was another attempt at building a mill in Rose Township. That attempt was made by John A. Wendell in 1842 in Section 22 of Rose Township. John Wendell had come to Rose in 1836 with several of his sons, similar to Cornelius Davis. In the first Rose Township government, John Wendell had been elected supervisor. He would serve till 1840 and again in 1842 and 1844. In the first government, he was also a justice of the peace and one of the poor masters. In 1842, he'd been elected to the House of Representatives of the state of Michigan when the capital was still in Detroit. It's likely the fact that he was a member of the House of Representatives was the reason he was able to get the legislature to pass a special act in 1842 that paved the way for him to build a mill in Rose Township. Specifically, the act authorized him to build a mill race and a dam across Buckhorn Creek and use the water for certain purposes. The purpose, a mill. His land in Section 22 had the Buckhorn Creek flowing through a corner of it. John Wendell wasn't the only one to get permission to build a dam. Someone got permission to build one on the Flint River, the Shiawassee River, other people on the Kalamazoo River. But why do you need authorization, permission, to build a dam on your own land? Well, the reality is, when you build a dam, it can impact people upstream from the dam, and it can impact people downstream from the dam. So in those days, you did need authorization. Specifically, what did the act allow John Wendell to do? He was authorized to cut a canal or a mill race across the land that he owned, and to take enough water from Buckhorn Creek to propel the necessary machinery for a gristmill or a sawmill, and to build a dam across the stream if it was necessary. But did he do it? Did he actually build the canal in Rose Township? Well, according to the Holly Register, looking back on the event, somewhere in 1845, he did dig a canal and an extensive ditch with the intent of building a gristmill. We can use a current aerial photograph to try and reconstruct what it was likely that John Wendell did. Here we have the Buckhorn Creek flowing through the area. It's likely that John Wendell put a dam somewhere around that location. And then he built the mill race or the canal up until this point. At that point, there's a fall, a drop in elevation of over 10 feet, which would have been a perfect place for a mill. And then he would have built the tail race, the other part, to run the water back into Buckhorn Creek. If we look today south of DeMode Road, you can see the remnants of the canal he built. But did he ever build the mill? We have evidence that he did build the mill race or the canal, but did he build the mill? According to the Holly Register, his funds running low, he turned it into a small tannery, which in a short time was abandoned. So it appears that he did build a structure, but he wasn't able to turn it into a mill. Likely ran out of money for the machinery that was needed, and it became a tannery. Likely it would have been right in this location. Today, it would have been probably on this site, along Milford Road just before you get to Demode Road. But why a tannery? Well, a tannery, where you're going to be turning hides into leather, took a lot of water. So the water source was there. It was the canal, the mill race that John Wendell had built, even though he wasn't able to complete the mill. But what happened to the tannery? Well, according to the newspaper, a Mr. Buell bought the building and turned it into a store and did a lively trade in dry goods for a few years. So the tannery was turned into a store. But who was Mr. Buell? A.W. Buell was Ahasuerus W. Buell, who just happened to be a nephew of John A. Wendell. He had come around 1840, it seems, to Rose Township because his uncle and his cousins were there. In 1846, he had actually built a little hotel along the White Lake Road in the area. It was likely right here along Milford Road, very close to the corner of Milford and Demode. David Gage had left Rose by this time, and so it really replaced David Gage's tavern. But what might it have looked like? Fortunately, we still have photos of some of the old taverns and inns. This is a New Hudson Inn built in 1831 in Lyon Township on the Grand River Trail. Here's a Botsford Inn built in 1836 in Farmington Township, again along the Grand River Trail. Here's the Waterford Hotel built in 1841 in Waterford Township on the Saginaw Trail. It's likely that Buell's Hotel looked like one of these, or maybe a combination of the styles. 1 year after he built the hotel is when he bought the tannery from John Wendell and ran the store in it. That would have been right next to his hotel. The 1850 census, however, has Mr. Buell in the census, but he's still listed as a tanner, so it's likely that beside the store he was still doing the tanning business. But what about his hotel? By 1850, he had sold the hotel to Everett Wendell, who was one of John Wendell's sons. It's listed as being a public house in the census, another word for hotel. So Everett Wendell, by 1850, had taken over the hotel, and he had given it a name. He had named it the Buckhorn Hotel. And as to what happened to Tannery, it's unclear what happened to that building. However, many historical records do say that across from the hotel, A.W. Buell had built a new store. By 1854, A.W. Buell had moved to Holly, where, according to Holly history, he established the first dry goods store in Holly. He became a prominent businessman there. He died in Holly in 1863, but he was not buried in Holly. He was buried in Rose Center Cemetery, along with his wife Catherine and 4 daughters who all died young. But what about the little village he had helped to start? Well, it was surviving without a mill. The Buckhorn Hotel was now, of course, a post office and the stagecoach stop, just as David Gage's tavern had been. Morris Burke appears to have taken over Mr. Buell's store. And Van Dyke Wendell, one of John Wendell's sons, had opened a blacksmith shop in the area. And it had a name. It was now called Buckhorn Village. So in section 22, a little village was growing in Rose, Buckhorn Village. But what was happening in the rest of Rose? Stay tuned. There's more history to come.